see right now, without LeBron, Lakers are struggling.
Let me tell you about a team I hate, all right? I know the Dallas Cowboy fan is here, so I had to make sure he knew how much I hate this team.
I'm ready.
I've often said that the people who run baseball, they try very hard to ruin it.
I'm from Brooklyn. I don't have a problem saying it to his face.
Oh, from Brooklyn.
Hey, guess any.
If you like the sweet science, get ready to talk boxing on the Gloved Fist podcast with top boxing writers Frank Latirzo and Jack Hirsch. Frank, a former amateur boxer out of Philadelphia, writes for NY Fights and can be seen on the Boxing Channel. Jack, an amateur boxer who competed in the New York Golden Gloves, was a 6-term president of the Boxing Writers Association. And now, here's Frank Latirzo and Jack Hirsch.
And we're back. Welcome to Glove Fist. My name is Frank Latirzo, former fighter, part-time writer, full-time observer, and I am a nickname guy. I love Travis Bickle. He is Pags of the Mac and Jack show. Jack, I had to get that on there because I know he watches this because he wants my football insight as much as yours. How are you doing tonight?
Good. Whenever we see our producer, Mac, at the start of the show, you know what it reminds me of? You being the coach, me being the quarterback, us talking on the sideline, and Mac being the backup quarterback, you know, with the clipboard standing there. That's what it reminds me of.
Mac, did you hear that? He always gives himself the higher position. When we first talked about this, he wanted me to be the mad dog, and he wanted to be Francesa. Now he's the coach.
Well, until we found out that you were ruder than I was, then we kind of switched.
All right, Jack, we have a special show tonight. This is the last show of the year. Got my Christmas sweater on. I don't like ugly sweaters. This is not an ugly sweater. It's a Christmas sweater. Jack, there were some big fights last weekend. There's a huge card coming up Saturday night. We're going to touch on that. And then we have a special guest coming on. His name is Glenn Lewis. He wrote a book titled Sparring with Smokin' Joe. That's Smokin' Joe Frazier. I told Glenn when I spoke to him, Jack, that you and I are huge Joe Frazier fans. I bent his ear when I spoke to him. We'll have some fun tonight. Glenn, sit back. We'll be with you in a couple of minutes. Jack, Christmas time. I only saw David Morrell fight. I'll hit that real quick. You take the rest of the weekend.
Yeah, it was the last event by the Showtime network. I mean, that made it really big, and David Morrell was the big star on the show. He won his fight in a couple of rounds. But more importantly, David Morrell is on the trail of David Benavidez. David Benavidez is supposed to be the monster. Everyone fears him. You know what this reminds me of, Frank? They said the same thing, remember, about Antonio Margarito at his best. He's the boogeyman. No one wants to fight him. And Paul Williams stepped up. They asked, who do you want to fight next? He says, I want to fight Antonio Margarito.
And he beat him.
No one else wants to fight him, and he beat him. So I don't want to hear Benavidez make up all type of excuses to avoid a fight with David Morrell and then call out other fighters like Canelo, let's be blunt, and then call out Canelo and say Canelo is ducking him. You want to force a fight with Canelo, David Benavidez? Take on David Morrell. Knock him off. Same thing I want to tell to Terence Crawford with the Boots Ennis. Fight Boots Ennis. Dispose of him. Don't make up excuses that anyone's ever ducking you by fighting a guy who's a little less. I know we hear, well, he doesn't have a big name. It'll be a bigger draw later on. I won't get enough credit for beating him. Bottom line is this, Frank. You and I and the people that listen to this show are fans. And if you heard a David Benavidez, David Morrell fight was signed, you would be salivating. Wow, what a fight. I want to see that fight. Terence Crawford, Boots Ennis, wow, I want to see that fight. So I'm tired of excuses. Best fighting the best. That's what we got last weekend in the flyweight fight. Bam Bam Rodriguez against Sonny Edwards. Bam Bam Rodriguez has scored a few big wins on his career. You know, he's still an up-and-comer. and he's getting close to having a Hall of Fame career with the guys he's beating. And he's a modest kid. He says, well, I belong in the top 10 pound for pound now. And he absolutely does. If you, Frank, look at the pound for pound list, there's some tired old names in there who are in there based on reputation. A Tyson Fury shouldn't be in the top 10 pounds.
Spence shouldn't be in there.
Spence shouldn't be there because he's been inactive, and the defeat to Crawford was so overwhelming.
I agree.
He's not a top 10. And Bam Bam Rodriguez, he's beaten live bodies, and he scored a tremendous win, beating a top of the line flyweight in Sonny Edwards. Kudos to Bam Bam Rodriguez.
Jack, I didn't see the fight. Let me just ask you this: it was stopped in the 10th round, right?
Yeah, Edwards got knocked down.
Was it ever in question?
In the early rounds, Edwards was doing some good things. He showed a lot of heart. But it was one of those fights where Edwards was staying in the fight, but Bam Bam was winning the rounds. Not overwhelmingly, but more importantly, the damage was slowly adding up. It was like, Frank, going to the bank every week and putting in a couple of $100. You're not rich at first, but after you're doing it for years, like you look at the bank account, it kind of looked like it all added up. And they were two-class fighters. And it was the best fighting the best, but they had the same promoter, Eddie Hearn, Matchroom Boxing. And fights like this get made usually when the fighters have the same promoter. When they have different promoters, we have a hard time making these fights. Like, for example, Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev. If they had the same promoter, the fight would have been made by this point.
Jack, let me just say this. I've seen Rodriguez. I like Bam Bam. I think he's a force. We'll have a lot of fun with him in 2024. I wish I could add more. You did a great job. I think that you echoed the sentiments of most people from who I respect and read. So I'm on board with that. The only thing I'll say before we move on to the big card is I can see Benavidez almost thinking he's like Crawford. Now, Crawford doesn't want to fight Boots because he has nothing to gain. I think Benavidez thinks that he's on the doorstep of fighting Canelo, and the risk-reward against Morrell doesn't fit. I know you don't want to hear that. I kind of don't want to hear that, but I think that that's what the holdup is. That said, this weekend, Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder are in separate fights, and Jack, you know what? I mean, they're fighting contenders. Anthony Joshua's fighting your boy Otto Weyland, 26-1. Wilder's fighting Joseph Parker, who's fought everybody in the division. Supposedly, if they both win, it's set for March, which would be on the heels of Fury and Usyk. So there's going to be some activity in the heavyweight division. Dimitri Bivol fights Lyndon Arthur on the card for the IBO light heavyweight and WBA super light heavyweight title. Daniel Dubois fights Jarrell Miller, and there's a plethora of other contenders on the card. I'll just say this off the bat. I'm going to take Anthony Joshua, Jack, to win a decision. And you're going to say I'm hedging, and I'm not. I'm just being honest.
Yeah.
I fear Anthony Joshua can lose to anybody competent. I'm going to take him because I'm a cynic, and the fight with Wilder is there if he wins. But I'm not confident he wins. But I'm taking Anthony Joshua to beat Wallin, and I'm going to take Wilder to beat Parker. Hope I'm wrong, but I think Wilder stops Parker probably within 5. And I'm going to give you an upset, and I actually think you're going to agree. Jarrell Miller is going to beat Daniel Dubois.
Wow. I haven't finalized my final picks. You're kind of pinning me down. But
we're not going to do a show until next year, so we got to go tonight.
Right. Yeah, and you have every right, too. Of the two fighters, who's more likely to get up? He's not that type of fighter anymore, but he comes into the ring in shape. He jabs well. He can pile up points. He can win.
He can punch, too, and he lets his hands go.
He could. In the last fight, he eventually got to Robert Helenius, in that fight. And I think Joshua is much more capable of winning rounds against Wallin than Wallin is against him. The X factor is Deontay Wilder. What has Deontay Wilder done since he's had that beatdown in the third Fury fight. That happened
2 minutes and
ages ago.
59 seconds. That's it.
We don't know what he has left to offer. And one of these days, he won't be able to push the button with the big punch. Then what happens? Wilder
gets beat.
Wilder tends to lose rounds in his fights. Joseph Parker is a very experienced guy, has a decent chin. He can peck away. He can win rounds. Maybe Wilder doesn't deliver the one-punch knockout. And if he doesn't deliver the one-punch knockout,
he loses.
He's not going to wear Parker down, I don't think. He doesn't cut the ring off himself. He relies on the long, straight punches to come out of nowhere. And you'd have to think that Wilder is going to connect at some point, that he'll still have the magic in his blows. But I could see Parker upsetting Wilder sooner than I can see Wallin upsetting Joshua.
Jack, I think you made a good case. And I don't like that Wilder hasn't fought in 2 years. I'm not going to, for other than the 3 minutes against Hellenius. But conversely, I do think that Parker could be one of those guys that will be a little bit in all of his power and will do just enough to lose a close fight. And I think Wilder probably still has the power. I think the rest has probably done him well. So I'm going to go with Wilder. I think he's going to get the stoppage. And again, I want to make this clear. I'm picking Joshua to win the fight. But I agree with everything you said on paper and stylistically. Wallin is not the type guy that could beat him. But, Jack, if we took any name out of the top 10 against Anthony Joshua, I would pick him 8 out of 10 times, but with reservation. So, do we agree or not? You have Joshua. We both have Joshua. Do you have Wilder or Parker?
I'm going to have to go with Wilder. I'm going to have to think that at some point Wilder connects. Parker seems to me to be a little long in the tooth as well. A little long in the tooth. You talk.
How about Dubois and Jarrell Miller?
I'm going to tell you, very intriguing fight. I'm going to go with Dubois to win that fight because I think Jarrell Miller, since those drug suspensions and all that inactivity, he was struggling with Lucas Brown until he finally subdued him. And Lucas Brown is an ancient fighter, basically. And, Miller talks a good game and so on. And I thought Miller missed his big opportunity when he tested positive for PEDs and was pulled out of the Joshua fight, and Andy Ruiz took his place. Because I was picking Miller to actually upset Joshua, and Andy Ruiz cashed in instead. I think Joshua Miller would have won that fight and been heavyweight, gotten that piece of the heavyweight title. But I just feel it's not there. I could see Dubois winning on points in this fight. And he gave Usyk a good fight, Dubois.
Jack, he did. However, I've never seen Jarrell Miller hurt. I think he's going to weather the early storm. And there's just something about Dubois, the way he lost in his last 2 fights, or the 2 fights he lost, kind of bothers me. So I'm going to take the wild card with Miller. Obviously, we're both going to pick Dimitri Bivol. The other fights are pretty much setups with Frank Sanchez and Apatea.
You're upsetting Lyndon Arthur, who did once upset Anthony Yard. But I agree, Bivol should win handily on points.
So, but Jack, in closing on that, let's just give some props out. I think the card's only $37 or $39.
Awesome.
You can't beat that. I paid $75 for... What was the fight that we just had with Andrade and Benavidez? Paid $75 for that. There was no intrigue after the first, maybe the second round. This, I'm going to have a whole day to watch fights, big name guys that I want to see. There'll be football on that day. I'm going to make a day of it. Everything Christmas-wise is done. I'm going to be there. I'm going to enjoy it. I'm just glad that we're getting a big card without. It's not going to cost us a lot of money, but something tells me down the road they're going to start inching the price up.
I would think so. It's a bargain. I don't know what type of business this show is going to do pay-per-view in the United States because it's starting in the daytime and the big fights essentially on the East Coast here in the daytime, the West Coast even early in the United States.
Right.
And I think pay-per-view is geared for the night person. You know, they buy it in bars, people have a night out. You know, so I don't know the type of business it's going to do. And also, Frank, keep this in mind. This card is geared for people like you, Ian, the people who listen to our show, real fight fans. How many real fight fans buy pay-per-view shows in comparison to just loose fight fans or just people who like boxing but aren't fans?
No, you're right. But the fact that they have Joshua and Wilder as a co-main event and they're supposedly going to fight, I think that'll help drum up some interest. And as I suspected, I think you were on board with this. Look, the bottom line is Anthony Joshua's the main event because he's the last fight. So
is that how they're doing it? Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, Joshua, Wilder and Parker are first, and then Joshua's the last fight on the card.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That sounds about right to me, and it just shows Joshua's marketability. And this heavyweight action is going to kind of be a lead-in to Fury and Usyk. Fury and Usyk, from what I understand, Frank, they have a rematch clause. I mean, I keep hearing things back and forth, and that would be bad for boxing. I mean, a rematch shouldn't be forced on us. You know, if it's a controversial decision,
if Fury wins, Jack, he won't fight Usyk again. He'll say, take the titles. I don't think he'll fight him again.
He could give up the titles and still box, I would guess.
Yeah, I don't think they'll make it different.
Well, if he's contractually obligated, there might be no wiggle room to get out of it. He couldn't get out of the Deontay Wilder third fight. He didn't want that fight, Fury. So finally he had to give in. I suppose that would be the same case with Usyk. But for matchmaking purposes, we don't want to see Joshua and Usyk again. Joshua and Fury, we would welcome.
Right. Yeah.
And Usyk, we would welcome. You know, that type of concept.
All the matchups that we haven't seen. We don't need to see Wilder and
what happened
and Fury again. None of that.
The big Chinese heavyweight Zhang, who destroyed Joe Joyce twice. What's happened to him? Who's he going to fight?
I think he's going to get a shot, Jack, in 2024 against somebody big it'll create interest in the division. It's like he's definitely a player. He's earned his wings. And Jack, speaking of heavyweights, we have a guest who wrote a book on a guy you and I both liked, who played second fiddle to another guy we both liked, but in the ring, they were equals. And Joe Frazier, so I'm talking about, Smoking Joe Frazier, confided in Glenn Lewis. Glenn Lewis was at the gym with Joe Frazier in the late 70s, early 80s, got to know him, talked to him, knows his son. Glenn and I had a great conversation. So can we bring Glenn up, Mac? Glenn, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Glenn, how are you? Say hi to my co-host, Jack Hirsch.
Hi, Jack. How you doing?
Hey, Glenn. How you doing?
Can you guys see me? All right.
You're the big G right now.
Yeah, we can't see it, Glenn, but that's okay.
Hold on. Let's see. I don't know.
Late 70s, early 80s. Well, Joe did fight Jumbo Cummings, I think, in 81, his last fight.
In 81. You know, basically, you know, when I met Joe, I originally did an interview with him and his son Marvis about Marvis's amateur career and Joe's plans for turning pro and things like that. And then I came back to Joe because the people from Esquire, I was writing for Esquire magazine, and had heard that Ali was coming out of retirement to fight Larry Holmes, and we suspected that Joe would follow suit and also come out of retirement.
They fought a week apart in 1981.
Exactly. And the big story would be, if both of them were somehow successful, would there be an Ali Frazier 4? And, where would that fight be? And obviously that fight would have been, like the mother of all combat fights. And so, that was really what the second article was supposed to be about. But the more I got to know Joe and the more I got to know Marvis, I realized there was a lot more to that than just, their combats.
Well,
Glenn, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
In the idea of writing the book, now I know you're fond of Marvis. I've told Jack before, and you and I discussed this, that Marvis is one of the best people I've ever met in my life. But really my question to you is this. Do you think it was an attempt on Joe's part to try to set the record straight regarding his feelings regarding Ali and the things that transpired before the fight of the century, all the way up until when Ali lit the flame at the Olympics and Joe said that Stan Hochman, he wanted to push him in the flame, in the fire. Do you think it was he wanted to set the record straight regarding Ali?
Well, I think he felt that he didn't like the way he went out, in his last couple of fights. Let's face it, he lost 4 fights in his career, and 2 of them were the last 2 fights he fought. And, so that left a sour.
It was a draw with Jumbo Cummings, actually. Officially, he didn't lose that fight.
No, I understand. That was a draw. But I'm talking about the main part of his career before the combat. And so that left this, a sour taste in his mouth. And I think he felt that also with Ali denigrating him, before the fight of the century, before the Thrill of Manila, he felt like his reputation had been damaged towards the end of his career. And so a big reason for the comeback and a big reason for pushing Marvis was because he felt he had to reestablish himself, in boxing and in the boxing world in some way. And he was
Go ahead, Jack.
conscious of it.
Yeah. Well, he did reestablish himself to an extent. I mean, it just didn't quite work out. He managed a couple of notable heavyweights, and he worked with them, Dwayne Bobbitt, Bert Cooper. Potentially, those guys could have, won the heavyweight title. Potentially,
Yeah, and there was some fighters from lower weight class.
James Schuler.
Terrence Coffin, an Olympian, from Philadelphia.
Right.
Yeah, with Joe a little while. Yeah. But with Marvis, was he living his life through Marvis, his dreams? Because he tried to turn Marvis into the type of fighter he was, but Marvis couldn't be that. He didn't have the power,
No, and that was the real problem. Georgie Benton was training Marvis, when I showed up and got to know him. And actually, you were there at the same time, right, Frank?
Mm-hmm.
You were training in Joe's gym the time that George Benton was there.
George Benton and Val Colbert.
Exactly. And they had the right idea. They had Marvis, more or less on the outside, moving in on, keeping a distance and
picking his spots, when to box and when to punch.
When to come in, hit hard, retreat, don't get hurt, don't take abuse. There was no reason for it.
Now, the problem was Joe would teach Will Chamberlain to box like him and throw away his strength. Joe Frazier thought in his mindset, if you weren't putting the pressure on and getting inside and basically smoking, you were losing. And that was not Marvis's style. And Joe, as great of a fighter as he was, and I think all 3 of us agree that he's underrated, he really wasn't a good trainer or manager.
No. And actually, that was a big part of the book. I really talked about Joe got rid of Benton after the first pro fight and took over as the main trainer and tried to get Benton to accept the role of like an assistant trainer or something like that. And Benton just walked away. He said, this is, the way you're handling him is wrong. It's not going to work. And he walked away. And Joe, as soon as Benton left the scene, Joe would get in Marvis's head. He would say to him, you got to get in close. You got to hit, with hooks the way I did. And Marvis would want to turn it on for his father, and he would try to fight inside times when he had no business being inside.
He just loved his father so much. And to get back what Jack was saying, Jack, you know something? Joe in the beginning did not want Marvis to fight. He actually made him work on the floor for 6 months before he let him box one time. And it's like he basically gave up and said, I can't keep him out of the gym. And then once Marvis had all that amateur success, Joe just, I think, as Glenn said, saw a way to get his name back in the limelight. And for a while, Marvis looked good and it worked. But, he just tried to make him to be somebody he wasn't.
But, Joe, I'll tell you something interesting. In the book, there's an interesting story about there was a regional Golden Gloves, the Philadelphia Regionals that Marvis was fighting in, and it was one of his last amateur fights.
Jimmy Clark.
No, I think it was a kid named Pitts, Johnny Lee Pitts, which was another story. I'll tell you about that if you're interested. But Larry Holmes was there as well, because Larry Holmes' younger brother, who was one of Marvis's friends, Mark Holmes was also fighting, in a lower weight class in the same regionals. And Joe, afterwards, we went out to celebrate Marvis's win, and we all, Joe, Larry, myself, Joe's family, we all went to a bar that, knew Joe, and we were celebrating. And Larry and Joe and I were in the bar area together. And Joe was pressuring Larry Holmes to promise that he would give Marvis a shot at the title within the first 2 years of turning pro. Now,
I never knew that, Jack. Did you?
No, I didn't know that either.
I was the only one who was there for it was me. I mean, it was like one of those things. And Larry, tried to be nice. And, he said, look, you know how much I care for Marvis. And then finally, he just said to Joe, I don't want to be the one to damage Marvis. I don't want to be the one to cause Marvis to be seriously hurt. And as much as I love Marvis, once I get in the ring and I have to protect myself and I have to fight the way you're supposed to fight in the ring, I'm going to take him apart. And I don't want to have to do that.
Let me ask you this.
And I'm sorry, but Frazier kept pressuring him. And finally, Holmes said, well, we'll see.
Never knew that. Go ahead, Jack.
Joe sparred a lot with Larry Holmes. Holmes was in his camp when he was a young fighter.
Right.
Joe had to know how good Holmes was based just on the sparring sessions. And was he just deluding himself into believing that Marvis would actually beat Holmes? I mean, just based on the session.
That's a hard one to call. I don't know if he actually believed that Marvis could beat Holmes. Certainly at that time, it was ridiculous. I mean, Holmes had so many, really good fights and good defenses, of his title, and he was undefeated. And it's, really hard to imagine that.
I'm going to give you a theory on this.
He just wanted so badly for his son to have a title shot.
Jack,
it really was.
And Glenn, I'm going to give you a theory on this.
What's
You
that?
both bring up a good point, but here's the theory. Remember, when Joe and Larry were sparring, they did most of their sparring in 73. Larry Holmes was a 9-fight pro, and Joe was training for the rematch with Ali in January of 74. At that time, Joe used to eat Holmes up. He walked through whatever he threw at him. He busted his rib, and I think that Joe thought that Larry was that same guy and that Marvis could handle him. And I don't think he ever took into consideration that, Larry got much bigger. I remember I gave him a ride in 79. It was 2 days after the Shavers Holmes fight when Shavers dropped Holmes in the 9th round. Now, Marvis hadn't turned pro yet, and Joe and I were talking about that fight, and he literally turned to me and said, Marvis could take both of those guys that fought the other night. So I think in his mind, he believed that he gave Marvis his style, and he knew Larry didn't like pressure. I think he thought Marvis had a shot to beat him, which was crazy because it was Holmes' 17th title defense and it was Marvis' 10th fight.
Well,
That's good stuff, Frank. Yeah, could I just say something? Glenn, too. Joe was criticized heavily just for making the fight Marvis against Holmes. But Dave Wolf, the great manager, a Boom Boom Mancini, Donnie Lalonde, was a brilliant manager who knew Joe well. He actually defended that because he said TV dates were so hard to get. And if he waited, he might not have even gotten the opportunity. He could have lost to someone else in the meantime. Why not get the really good payday, take the chance with Marvis? Because Marvis wasn't a blue chip prospect who you could count on, to keep winning. So Joe took a shot, the first chance he had with Marvis against Holmes, and Dave Wolf really didn't have a problem with it.
Joe also said, Jack, you can't turn down a title shot.
No, I understand that. But I think that Joe really sold Marvis short in a way. And it's sort of surprising. I don't think he meant to do it. But Marvis turned out to be a pretty good fighter. He had 19 fights. He won 17 out of 19. He only lost 2 fights. He lost to Holmes. As you mentioned, he fought Holmes after only 10 pro fights. And he lost to Tyson when he wasn't ready for Tyson yet.
No, they're the 2 best heavyweights of the 80s, and they're the only ones that beat him.
Those are the only guys he lost to.
But Glenn, Marvis could not take a punch. He got knocked out by James Broad that deprived him of having a spot on the boycotted Olympic team.
Yeah, but if you look at that.
As soon as Holmes hit him and as soon as Tyson hit him, he showed no durability at all. I mean, he just couldn't take a punch at the end of the day.
Well, all right. He got hit hard by some pretty good fighters, and he fought some pretty good fighters, other than them.
Bone Crusher hit him with a great shot, and he survived.
Yeah, and, and Bugner also. And Bugner was still
Bugner couldn't punch.
Bugner won a championship when he was late in his 40s, so.
It was a WBF title. I know maybe Frank likes that title. I know.
Yeah. No,
Jack, you and Glenn are both right. Marvis did not have a first-tier chin, but as far as the him taking a shot, the James Broad, if you remember, he fought James Broad in the pros and won every round. When he got hit by James Broad in the amateurs, Marvis what was it, Glenn? Something wrong with his neck. He had an incision.
He had congenital weakness in his neck.
Because I saw him get stopped by that big Canadian guy sparring the same thing. His leg, he wasn't even hurt. He was conscious, and his legs went, and he went down.
And then he had surgery. He had surgery after his 3rd pro fight or something like that. And the surgery actually fixed the problem, and he really didn't have that problem again. Look, Larry Holmes, when he fought Holmes, was enormous. I mean, Larry was a huge fighter at that point. Not only was he, big, he was broad, and he was a man. It
was the end of his prime. He was right at the end of his prime.
Exactly. And he was enormous at that point. And I just think, he had too much. And the same thing with Tyson. Tyson was putting everybody out in the first round.
Yeah, that was a bad matchup.
I want to ask Glenn something, and maybe, Glenn, you can only speculate on this, but I kind of wonder what the answer is. Holmes was in camp with Smoking Joe and Muhammad Ali, and Holmes himself said if Ali ever needed him, he'd be there in a minute. If Joe ever needed him, he'd be there in a second. He seems to absolutely love Joe Frazier, Larry Holmes.
He does.
He liked Ali, loved Frazier, and was in camp with both of them. Why was the appeal of Smoking Joe more? You get the feeling that if Joe fought Ali, Holmes would be rooting for Joe.
I tell you what I found to be true about Joe. Joe is a very sincere guy. He was very transparent. He really wore his emotions on his sleeve. He was very clear about how he felt about things. He talked to everybody. He never traveled with an entourage. He never kept people at a distance. I would go into bars with him, down south, and these farmers would come over, and he would be drinking with them and talking to them and reminiscing with them, and he was accessible to everybody. And that hit home. Larry Holmes is very similar in that respect. I think Holmes, found that appealing.
All right, I'm going to throw something into the mix, Glenn. Then I have a question for you.
Sure.
Jack, to answer your question, I'm going to tell you another reason why Holmes and Frazier were so close. Not only were they both from Pennsylvania or out of Pennsylvania, but they were both overshadowed by Ali. Holmes never lived up to Ali's expectation after Ali retired. And when Frazier was active, Ali was always hovering over his head. So I think the fact that they both felt they never got their due because of Ali, I think that's a bond they had. Now, Glenn, my question to you is, look, everybody, when they talk about Frazier, they want to talk about Ali. Let's change it up a little bit and let some of the people that are listening and watching us tonight, who are some of the other fighters? I mean, as Joe said many times, his career was more than Muhammad Ali. Who are some of the other fighters that Joe fought that you got the sense that he really respected, or he had something to say about them that stood out to you?
All right. Well, first of all, Jerry Quarry. I mean, one of their fights was the fight of the year, by Ring Magazine. And he always felt, he didn't, on paper, he didn't have a lot of trouble with him, but his fights were difficult. And Quarry, Quarry hit him. He hit hard. He stayed in there. He pressured, Joe during the fights. He pressured Ali during the fights. He did a lot of damage to Ali when he was fighting Ali. So he was a good fighter. And another guy that obviously made an impression, maybe not for the right reason, was Oscar Bonavena. Oscar Bonavena, Joe just complained about how dirty he was. And he would say he was a great fighter, and he pushed him, and the fights were close. But ultimately, what he remembered most was Bonavena would constantly hit low. And, Joe was so damaged, in the groin area after he fought Bonavena, it was like ridiculous.
Well, I have a theory, guys, that's never brought up. If you remember Joe on the way up, he would be somewhat arrogant towards opponents. I think Ali, all of Ali's barbs made Joe a better person, made him more humble, made
Absolutely.
him less of a bragger. A case in point, When Joe beat Jimmy Ellis, okay, in that unification fight, February 1970, 13 months before fighting Ali,
Right.
after the fight, he didn't compliment Ellis. He said, my sparring partners are quicker than Jimmy. He was saying they were better than Jimmy Ellis. He wouldn't throw a bone
Well,
Jimmy
let's
Ellis's
remember.
way
Let's
as far as
remember.
being complimentary.
No, and
And
that's
he
a good point.
badmouthed Buster Mathis too in certain ways, even though he said Buster gave him his hardest fight. When Don Dumpy said to Joe, well, Buster may have won some of those early rounds, he said Buster didn't win any of those rounds. That
Right in the ring, he said that.
Well, look,
Yeah.
he had a soft spot, for Buster Mathis. You got to remember the guy prevented him initially from going to the Olympics. He felt that Buster didn't really deserve to win those fights, as an amateur. He felt that was a fluke, and he felt a little bit like undercut by that. And, so that was obvious. I think with Jimmy Ellis, if you remember, before
Ellis was a little cocky to Frazier, Jack, before those fights too.
But that
was
goes
putting
without
Frazier
saying.
down. He was saying that he's going to take him easily. And Joe really was annoyed by that years later and talked about how he wanted to punish, really punish Ellis in the ring. And I think, look, these guys have a long memory. And Joe fueled himself on revenge. Every single fight in some way for Joe was a revenge fight. There was some slight from the past. Some of it he would invent, to get himself fueled up. But he always, put a revenge angle there and felt that like there was some sort of hurt that he had to redress, and that was Ellis.
Len, did you ever talk with Joe about his relationship with Ken Norton? Because when Joe was still close to his prime and Norton was in his, there was a lot of talk about Norton being matched with Joe, and Norton was a sparring partner. They shared the same trainer. Eddie Futch was Norton's head trainer.
Right.
Joe's assistant trainer, and they were good friends. They were fond of one another.
Right.
But Ted Norton always said business is business. It's not personal. He'd fight Joe. It's strictly business. And Joe said he wouldn't fight Norton unless it was for a ridiculous amount of money because Norton's his buddy. He'll never get in the ring with him. What's the real story
he
there?
talked a little bit about that, a little bit, not as much as some of the other guys. I think he felt there wasn't a big enough upside to beating Norton. Not the way there was in beating Ali or taking, or he really didn't match up well with George Foreman. Let's face it, that was the worst matchup in the world for him. But he felt there was a much bigger upside to beating George Foreman and beating, Ali than beating Ken Norton. And he was risking a lot against Norton. I mean, Norton was a good fighter. And I think he felt there wasn't enough for him to gain.
Yeah, he was too far ahead of him at that time because by the time Norton beat Ali, Frazier was trying to get a rematch with Foreman, and there was talk of the second fight. I don't think there was enough there for that fight. I do agree. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, Glenn.
Sure.
And Jack and I we kind of agree on this, that Joe kind of accepted. He just wasn't, George Foreman just had his number.
Oh, totally.
And he was pretty much at peace with that. Did you get that out of him?
Yeah, I did. He admitted that, Foreman was too powerful. First of all, he had too long a reach. He had a very long reach, and he was too powerful for Joe to bob and weave and work his way into the body.
And get inside.
He never could penetrate Foreman's defenses. And also Foreman hit really hard. And once he would get inside, the exchanges were really damaging. And
he could never get inside.
He just knew that his style and Foreman's style didn't mesh.
You know,
And
it's interesting, Glenn.
it wasn't a good matchup.
1996, I was with Joe alone in a studio interviewing him. He had his book coming out at the time. And I asked him who would have won between you at the first Ali fight at your absolute best, you in the ring against Foreman. And he didn't answer the question until I had to ask it a second time. And then he admitted it wouldn't have made any difference. It was a question of style that Foreman, you know, he feels Foreman would have beaten him no matter what.
You know, it's amazing because Ali is about the same size as Foreman, at least in height and reach.
On paper, they're the same size.
Yeah, on paper. Thank you. But Joe really matched up well with Ali. You know, once he bobbed and weaved and got under his, you know, defenses and got inside, you know, Ali wasn't really a good inside fighter. He didn't like, inside fighting. You mentioned the other day, Frank, that Ali didn't like to punch down.
Nope.
And I think that was part of it also. And I think, you know, that that Frazier just felt that once he got inside, he could literally take him down from the bottom up. And he never felt that with Foreman at all.
I always wondered about one thing, guys, with the Ali Frazier feud, which really wore on Joe. At some point, and I think Ali would have been very agreeable to this, if Ali went to Philadelphia, sat down with Joe one-on-one, looked him in the eye and said, you know, I really apologize, man, everything I said about you. You know, I really don't want you to harbor these ill feelings. I'm truly sorry. I think that would have been the best medicine for Joe, you know, to maybe move on. If Ali came to him directly, because Joe
didn't that happen, Jack, in 202 at the All-Star game?
Well, yeah, but that was so towards the end of their lives.
You know something? You know something? This came up with Joe and I talked about this as well.
Yeah.
There was one point where there was an article written in Sports Illustrated and then another one, I think in the New York Times, where Ali had, you know, apologized to Joe and said he wanted to end whatever this feud was. And Joe said, that wasn't Ali apologizing. That's him using the press just to play another round of this, you know, in the press. If he really wanted to apologize to me, he would do what you said, Jack. He would do it face to face, and he would do it without anybody looking and anybody seeing and anybody judging. He would do it honestly. And he just lost. You got to remember, these guys were very close originally. They worked out together. They were very supportive of each other. They were good friends. There were times where Joe would come to New York and meet Ali, and they would drive around together and walk around together and, you know, like hang out in New York together. And the same thing in Philadelphia. And, you know, all of a sudden when he came back and they were having, you know, the fight of the century, when Ali started to promote the fight and said all those negative things about him, that wasn't pre-scripted. Joe wasn't in on you know, the deal there. Joe was shocked. Joe,
he felt Ali turned on him.
Guys, you used the word promoted the fight. That's a sore point with me in the Ali Frazier situation. I'm sure to a degree Ali was promoting the fight, but the things he said about Joe, that wasn't promoting the fight. That was Ali psyching himself up. That was Ali being Ali. It wasn't with a plan. Oh, I want to build a gate up. It wasn't a calculated plan.
No, they were guaranteed money.
Yeah, I don't go for this promoting the fight stuff.
When I spoke to Joe about that, he said, you know something, it doesn't wash. He said, when Ali was saying all those things about me, you got to remember, not only was that the fight of the century as far as a matchup, having two undefeated champions fighting for the undisputed heavyweight championship, you know, for the first time, but it was also the fight of the century as far as the monetary situation for fighting in general. I mean, they raised the purses in all fights after that.
Yep.
It was the first time that they had closed circuit TV around the world, and they sold it out around the world. They had a major, the Garden was sold out.
Jack and I were both there.
I was in the last row.
My seats were a little better than that, but we were both there.
Yeah.
Glenn, let me ask you this.
So, that didn't wash because he said everything was pre-sold. What the hell was he selling?
No, Allie took it too far.
Comments.
Glenn, Allie did not like that Frazier was the one guy who he fought that he just knew was not all they're intimidated by him, and he tried to find a way to circumvent it. But here's my question to you, and it's funny. I've always wondered this. I don't know if you can answer it, but you might have a little insight. Does Joe ever? Do you think he ever really appreciated, or do you think he felt that Allie cheated him out of it with the things he said afterwards? But did Joe ever relish the fact that in the modern era of boxing, I mean, we can talk about Lewis and Schmeling being a big fight because there were political ramifications. But as far as two guys fighting, Ali Frazier 1 was the biggest fight in the history of the sport, and only one guy won it. His name was Smoking Joe Frazier, and he won it conclusively. Did he ever take pride that, like, you know what, guys can make 50 defenses or retire undefeated, but only I won the biggest and most celebrated and anticipated fight in history? Do you think he ever relished that or realized how big that victory was, or do you think he felt he never got full credit for it?
No, I think he appreciated that, and also you got to realize that was vindication for him. He felt like that fight was a chance to shut up all of Ali's supporters, to shut up Ali, to make his place in history. It covered all those bases. And
it solidified him as an all-time great, but it never shut up the Ali faction.
Bert Sugar said it best. He talked about as Ali's myth and popularity and legend grew, that Joe's was sure to suffer. The winner that night was the loser. The loser that night was the winner.
Yeah.
If you think about it, that was the best thing that ever happened to Ali, was losing that fight.
Yeah,
because
but that goes back to the second fight, which you and I discussed the other night. Did Joe Frazier lose that fight, or was it simply that the boxing establishment needed Ali to win so badly?
Ali outpointed him at tag, and the boxing establishment needed him to win.
It was a legitimate victory for Ali. I wouldn't read too much into it. You could argue that it was a close fight if you want, but
Jack, let me ask you this, and I said this to Glenn. I agree with what you just said, but let's just say there was never a third fight, and all we had in history were the 15 rounds of the first fight and the 12 rounds of the second fight, in total 27 rounds. If they never fought in Manila, I would say that just in their rivalry, Frazier got the slightly better, because I thought Frazier won the first fight by more than Ali won the second fight.
I agree, but I think the third fight lifted Frazier's legacy back up again. The Manila fight, after he, got stopped by Foreman, lost the rematch to Ali. He needed that third fight for the status.
I think you're right,
Jack. The thriller in Manila. So
yeah, you're right. Look, I think Frazier really, showed his mettle in the middle rounds there. The middle rounds of the thrill in Manila.
Oh, from rounds 5 to 10, I don't know how Ali made it.
He was at his peak, I think, in those 5 rounds. He showed his mettle, and I think people will remember that.
A lot of boxing people never doubted it, but I guess there are some people that maybe they did, but he didn't have to show me. I knew what he was as a fighter. And Jack and I,
Glenn, I have a difference of opinion with Frank on this. Okay,
Sure.
Slight difference. He feels that the Joe Frazier of March 8th, 1971, at its absolute peak, would have beaten the best of Ali. Would have gotten by him. The best
that we saw.
I think the Ali before the layoff would have outpointed Joe. It would have been a reasonably close fight. Joe would have given him all he could handle. I'm not going to argue with that fact.
You got to realize, I realized that Ali was coming back after a long layoff, and it's hard to quantify what 3.5 years, is going to do to,
If you didn't know he was coming off a layoff, the way he fought, no one would have guessed it.
Yeah, but let's also remember that he had 2 or 3 really quality tune-up fights.
Two of them
against contenders. He fought Oscar Bonavena. Who's the other fight against?
Quarry.
It was a good version of Ali that fought Frazier the first time. A very good version of Ali, but that extra edge. It wasn't the Ali of the Liston fight, not the Ali of the Ernie Terrell fight. It is absolute zenith.
Glenn, let me have.
On the other hand, Ali was up on his toes. He was dancing
for 5 rounds.
He was doing all the things that he was sort of known for. And I think Frazier, pressured him a lot and cut off the ring a lot and really didn't give him a chance to breathe. I think Frazier would have beaten him at his best.
Glenn, let me just set the record straight, because sometimes I think Jack likes to mess with me a little bit. Jack, here's what I'm saying, okay? The best, when I say that, I mean if we take Frazier of 71 and match him against the best Ali from 71 to 75 or 64 to 67, I think the 71 Frazier beats Ali. However, so I think the best Frazier beats the best Ali that we saw. However, if Ali was not exiled and they would have fought in 68 or 69, Frazier wouldn't have been as good as he was in 71, and Ali would have been better than he was in 67 or 66 or 67. So I think Ali wins under that scope. But if I take Frazier 71 and put him in the ring with Ali that fought Chuvalo in 66, I might give the edge to Joe.
Let me ask you a question. How do you think Ali would have improved over those years if he wasn't exiled?
I think he would have been strong.
How would he have been better? How would he have been better?
I think he would have been more. I think he would have filled out and got stronger, as we saw, and he would have been a little more accustomed to his body, and he wouldn't have lost the coordination. I think when Ali came back from Quarry on, he was about 4 pounds bigger, 5 pounds bigger, and I don't think he ever quite adjusted to his body, and he never stayed in great shape after that.
Okay, well, that pretty much, we're towards the end of the show here, Glenn. Now, I have to stop Frank, because when it comes to Smoking Joe, Frank will talk for the next hour and a half. He'll lose.
Glenn knows that.
Right.
I know that. And so will I. Yeah.
Okay, so Frank, you're wrapping it up or what?
All right. Everybody, Glenn, first of all, Jack and I want to thank you for coming on and bringing your insight.
Thank you so much.
I'm sure down the road there'll be a reason that we'll have you back on. I'm sure you and I will talk down the road. Jack, all I can say is this. This is 2 years. It's been fun. Let's keep doing it. And hopefully that the sport will give us something to talk about in 2024. We'll have a lot to talk about when we come back. A big fight, fighter of the year, knockout, the whole bit. So all I can say is this. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you, Jack, for being a great co-host. And happy Hanukkah and Merry Christmas. Jack, Take us out.
Happy holidays to everyone out there. Happy holidays to you, everyone out there. See you next year, Frank.